We would like to welcome you both here as co-authors of the book, Denmark Vesey's Garden. My name is Jay Gooseby Smith, and I'm here at the Citadel in several capacities, but for our purposes today, I serve as director of our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center, and just wanted to let you know how excited I am to meet you and to engage in dialogue with you about this most important book. And John Ray, he'll kick us off with some brief introductions.
Yeah, and I am John Ray Roberts. I am over in the Cradle Center for Leadership and Ethics and am the coordinator of leadership assessment here. And just to echo that, I've got the book here. I don't know if I showed this already, but this is one of my favorite books and have used it, the material in my class to inform conversation and talking about what that looks like. And so we're just really excited for you all to be here and talk about Denmark Vesey's Garden now, which is a very in-depth historical look at the history of slavery and how we, have chosen to forget certain pieces of that history. And so, Blain and Ethan, we'd love for you all just to do a brief introduction of who you are and where you are, and then we can talk a little bit about the book.
Sure.
Okay.
Blain, you want to start?
Sure. So I am Blain Roberts, and I want to thank both of you for having us today to this virtual event. It's always nice to talk about Charleston and to talk to people who live in Charleston about Charleston, so we really do appreciate it. I am a U.S. historian, currently teaching at California State University, Fresno, where Ethan is as well. But we were in Charleston from 2005 to 2007. I taught at the Citadel for those 2 years, where I really enjoyed my experience and had some fantastic colleagues in the history department, many of whom are still there. Ethan?
Sure. So like Blain said, I was also in Charleston for a few years, a long time ago now, but about when we started doing the earliest research for this book. I was at the Citadel for 1 year. I was just a lecturer, a lowly lecturer, so I didn't wear the uniform. And before that, our first year in Charleston, we'd moved from graduate school in Chapel Hill to Charleston in 2005. Our first year, I was at the Avery Research Center, which is part of the College of Charleston. So I was a postdoctoral fellow there. And we moved out here to Fresno, California. Like Blain, I teach at Fresno State and I'm a 19th century historian. Blain's mostly a 20th century historian. So in some ways, this book, Denmark Vesey's Garden, which focuses on the long memory of slavery for the last 150 years, is kind of a way for us to meet in the middle intellectually in terms of our respective fields of expertise.
And it may or may not be obvious, but we are married. So just throw that out for audience members who might be confused about why we would be following each other around.
I was not stalking her across the and we remain, and we co-authored a book and remain married, which many people warned us that you shouldn't write a book together with anyone, but certainly not with your significant other, because you'll end up divorced. But
yes. Well, again, we thank you all so much for being here. So I figure we'll just jump right in. John Ray and I had more questions than we could ever hope to ask, but the first one, just to jump right in, just how integral to the history of Charleston was the institution of slavery?
You want me to tackle this one, Blain?
Okay.
Well, it couldn't have been more integral, I think is one way to put it. We call Charleston the capital of American slavery in the book, and for good reason. It was. There's no place in the United States where slavery was more important than Charleston. It was the center of the international slave trade in the colonies that would become the United States and in the early United States. We think about 50% of the enslaved people that were brought to what would become the United States came through the port of Charleston. That's about 200,000 individuals. After the closing of the slave trade in the early 1800s, Charleston becomes a hub of the domestic slave trade, slave trade where people are bought and sold locally, but also often purchased and then relocated to the south and to the west to the cotton plantations of Mississippi and Alabama, Texas and Louisiana and the like. It was also a hub of pro-slavery thinking, a sort of center of pro-slavery thinking, the defense of slavery, and that really culminates in the secession crisis in the late 1850s and early 1860s. Secession itself starts in South Carolina, and the vote for secession in South Carolina, removing itself from the United States in defense of slavery. That vote happens in Charleston. And then, of course, several months later in early 1861, April 1861, the start of the Civil War with the firing on Fort Sumter and the surrender of the U.S. Held Fort Sumter in April of 1861 takes place in Charleston. So there's no place where that was more benefited more from slavery, and no place that was more committed to the defense of the institution of slavery.
Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things that I really saw that, and I really didn't realize that until I really kind of delved into the book. Also, you referred to it as it kind of going from the cradle of slavery to the cradle of the Confederacy. Are there links between the notion of cradle of the Confederacy and cradle of slavery?
Well, I think that it's no coincidence that this place that was really the capital of American slavery became the cradle of the Confederacy. This was the place where those Southerners, white Southerners, who withdrew from the Union, seceded from the Union in defense of slavery, really made their intentions known that they were going to do this. It's where the Confederacy was created. And so it's not in any way coincidental. There's a very, very tight connection between those two things, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's worth really underscoring is there's nothing debatable about the coming of the Civil War in terms of the motivations. Mm-hmm. Those who were leading the march out of the United States, which really starts in earnest after Abraham Lincoln's election in November of 1860, they made it very, very clear why they were leaving. That mm-hmm. a man who was a representative of the Republican Party, which at the time was an anti-slavery party, at least certainly an anti-expansion of slavery party. They did not want to see slavery expand into the West. The election of a president who opposed slavery, who was morally objected to it, was unthinkable in a place like Charleston, in a state like South Carolina, and in many parts of the South. And so they would underscore that again and again. This is what the South Carolina Secession Convention would say. We are leaving because this person threatens this. And this institution, economically, socially, politically, was at the foundation of Southern states and Southern society.
And so after slavery, one of the things that you all talk about is the narrative regarding slavery. And so what has been the narrative since the abolishment of slavery in Charleston or the South? So after it was abolished, what has been kind of the narrative? That was a very central part of the early part of your book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, so I think that one thing that is kind of important to our own personal story is that we became interested in this narrative, maybe I should say narratives, competing narratives, as a result of our living in the city of Charleston from 2005 to 2007. Mm-hmm. We went on a lot of tours of downtown Charleston. You know, when you live in Charleston, people love to come visit.
Right.
I was also involved in, I think, one or two tours where I took Citadel cadets on a walking tour of downtown. We went to mm-hmm. area plantations. You know, we did a lot of the things that one mm-hmm. might expect. And one of the things that we found is that the narrative that was being kind of spun at a lot of local sites and by a lot of local tour guides was not accurate. Mm-hmm. It was a very whitewashed narrative or history of slavery and the Civil War. And as historians, of course, we found that troubling. And so one of the kind of starting points for this book was our attempt to really reckon with what the modern tourism industry was doing in the city. And so what we did, we started kind of researching this really after we moved to California. which is not really the best way to do a research project. Honestly, that's, you know, several thousand miles away, but that's what we did. We started looking into how these stories had developed over time and what the really competing narratives were. So there were essentially two competing narratives. One we call the whitewash narrative of slavery or version of slavery. This was a narrative that was forged by former slave owners and their descendants immediately after emancipation of the Civil War. And according to this version of history, slavery was not all that important to Charleston, to South Carolina, to the nation. It did not play a major role in generating the wealth of white Charlestonians, white South Carolinians. According to this whitewashed narrative, slavery wasn't all that bad. It was a really benign institution. It was good for the enslaved. It was civilizing for the enslaved. Masters were kind and loving. According to the whitewash narrative, slavery did not play the central role in bringing on the Civil War. And what you can see when you are studying the history of memory in Charleston is that this whitewashed memory has been dominant in the public sphere for a long time. Now, other side of the coin is what we call the unvarnished memory of slavery. Ethan, you want to explain that one?
Sure. And so to put it simply, the unvarnished memory of slavery, which tended to be promoted by and reinforced and echoed by enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and their descendants. So most often Black Charlestonians, some white Charlestonians joining alongside, basically argued the very opposite of the whitewashed version, that slavery was violent, was brutal, was essential to American history, to the history of the Low Country of South Carolina, to Charleston, that slavery had everything to do with the coming of the Civil War, unlike the lost cause arguments of the whitewashed version, which held that the Civil War is about a whole sorts of different things that were unrelated, states' rights. On the unvarnished tradition said, no, the Civil War is absolutely about slavery, a defense of slavery. And one curious thing, I think that one of the things we discovered in writing this book is that the unvarnished tradition was actually predominated in Charleston in the years just after the Civil War. That while what Blain was just saying is absolutely true, that the whitewashed memory of slavery has been the dominant one over the long history, the 150 years since the end of the Civil War. Most of that time, the whitewashed has been the one you would find in the public sphere, on monuments and in textbooks and things like that. Early on, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, it was the unvarnished tradition. And if I thought I might share this story that I think is among the most striking. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, about a month after, at least not after the Civil War, sorry, it's the final months of the Civil War, but the immediate aftermath of the fall of Charleston to Union forces, to the United States military. As the United States military occupies Charleston in the spring of 1865, enslaved people, now newly free people, decide they're going to put on a series of commemorations of their liberation to highlight what's changed. And they're really powerful moments of them sort of taking over public spaces where they've long been not allowed to congregate, and marking the end of this institution of slavery. And the most famous happens on March 21st, 1865. I only remember that because that happens to be my birthday. But on March 21st, 1865, formerly enslaved people in Charleston put on a huge parade, a parade through town that marks the death of slavery. And they have a bunch of symbolic things that they do. They pull a hearse through town, a hearse that's marked with a coffin that's named slavery, right there. It's a funeral procession for slavery. Slavery is dead. But one of the most striking elements of that is there was also a part of this parade was a wagon that was being pulled, and on it there were 4 formerly enslaved people who were pretending to still be enslaved. And there was a mock slave auctioneer, another formerly enslaved person who was pretending to be the slave auctioneer and was calling out, as the parade goes by, calling out, who will bid on these people? Who will bid on these people? You know, this fine person for sale. And the newspapers that document this event, this moving event, talk about how some of the formerly enslaved women in the audience watching as this parade goes by would start to break down in tears, overwhelmed by what they know is a mock event, but lose control of themselves for a moment as they remembered their own family members, their own children being sold, and start shouting out, "Give me back my children, give me back my children." And so to me, and to us, I think that's one of the most striking examples of this unvarnished memory of slavery. Slavery has come to a close. They are marking it, they're celebrating it, but they're also saying, this is something that ripped families apart. We must remember that. We must not lose sight of that. And just a month after it comes to a close in Charleston.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll just add to that really quick is that I always feel that it's important to state clearly for those who, you know, may have gone to school, say in the 50s or 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, like I did, the unvarnished memory narrative is the accurate one. It's really important to state clearly that the historical record tells us that slavery was central to all of these things, that slavery was awful, that it was violent. And so it's important to state clearly that the whitewashed memory is false and essentially served as propaganda created by white Southerners in the wake of the Civil War for a variety of reasons that we you know, go into in the book and can talk about. But anyway, I just want to, you know, point that out because I think it's important. Sometimes we use the word narrative or memory or tradition, and it could be misconstrued to suggest that it's not truthful, but the unvarnished memory is very truthful.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. And that parade scene was just so visceral to me in my mind for two reasons. One, because you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, that part of it occurred on the Citadel Green.
Yep.
And I'd love to hear a little bit about that. And then the other part of that was about the trauma that was so obvious that those spectators looking at it, even though they knew it was fictional, felt. And so I wanted to know if you could say a little bit about the role and the significance of where the Citadel Green was and why that mattered. And also about if you see any modern day or in your research examples of the trauma that still remains, because that trauma is very deep.
Yeah. Should we start with the first one there? Those are two big, big questions. So
I'm sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. Do you want to start, Blaine, or you want me to?
Well, sure. So many Charlestonians know that the current location of the Citadel is, in fact, the second location of the Citadel. It was constructed near Hampton Park in the 1920s. Originally, it was located in what was called the Citadel Green, but is now Marion Square. And that was an important spot in antebellum Charleston. And for that particular parade to have happened there had a lot of symbolic meaning, largely because of why the Citadel was constructed in the first place. And that has to do with Denmark Vesey, whose name, of course, appears in the title of our book and who many local Charlestonians have heard of today. Denmark Vesey was enslaved, lived in Charleston, but managed to buy his freedom because he won the city lottery, which is always just kind of a crazy story to talk about. So he bought his freedom, but family members remained enslaved. And of course, he was an early member of the church that is now Emmanuel AME Church, a lay leader there. So increasingly frustrated by the slave regime in antebellum Charleston, he plotted a slave insurrection that was to have taken place on July 14th, 1822. But the plot was foiled before it could be carried out. And so he and a number of other people involved in this plan were executed by Charleston authorities. And the Citadel is a direct response to that. This was one of the things that locals did to tighten slave supervision in the wake of this failed insurrection. The Citadel was, I think it was 1820, sorry.
30.
30 that the building was built. And there were guards there. And their job was to essentially make sure that no future slave rebellion happened. And so it was put on the green, or in the green that is now Marion Square. And so something like the Slavery is Dead parade, for that to happen at that particular location is so symbolic, right?
I mean, that was literally the parade ground.
Yeah.
The parade grounds now on the new Citadel campus, the Citadel Green was the parade. It wasn't very green. You know, and it was the parade ground. So to begin a march at the end of slavery in this place that was part of, you know, in our book, we call this the original Citadel, part of the Charleston's architecture of racial control. It was part of a series of buildings that included the workhouse, which is a place where enslaved people were put in jail. Denmark Vesey and his co-conspirators were put in jail, were tortured there. It was part of an overall system of buildings, but also a military system, a police and military system designed to maintain control over what was an enslaved majority population. Charleston and the Low Country more generally was a majority Black, majority enslaved, and white slaveholders often lived in fear that these people they were profiting off of and whose families they were breaking up would one day rise up and murder them. And so they created a system to make sure that to limit that effectiveness of that the possibility of that happening. And so, like Blain suggested, it was the Citadel was created based on the state law was passed right after Vesey's failed conspiracy to provide money to create this building, to house the arms, to house soldiers. It wasn't until the 1840s, 43, I think, that cadets became the folks who were stationed in there. And that was basically the city and the state's way to not pay anyone to do it, to sort of get it on the cheap.
That's a whole nother topic.
Right. Before that, for a while it was U.S. soldiers. For a while it was local state militia, but they had to pay those guys. And so, hey, cadets come cheap. You know, but that is the origins, and that's why it was, as you suggested, so symbolic for them to appropriate that space and to start, and that becomes the starting point of a lot of parades in this period during Reconstruction. They would often start there and then wind their way down, and either wind their way back up through the peninsula to that area, or they just wind their way down in White Point Garden at the Battery.
Absolutely. And then during Reconstruction, they put the Calhoun statue there, which was recently in the news this fall, which it is no longer there.
Yes, right. Yes, that is, that's remarkable.
Well, we talk about that in the book, and one way to think about the Calhoun statute is that it's sort of an extension of the function of the Citadel, you know, put in at a much later time. It really represents the Jim Crow order, right? It was put in the 1880s, and then the second one was actually put in the 1890s. And so it was kind of inscribing white supremacy in that same spot at a later date.
And one of the ladies, part of the women's group that put it up talked about it inspiring Citadel cadets.
Yes.
I think you know, this is why one of the reasons we wanted to put it there.
You'd asked about trauma.
Yes.
And, you know, for me, one of the most interesting things about researching this book is that there were certainly people we uncovered in oral history interviews and things like this who said, you know, my family didn't really talk too much about slavery, you know, in, let's say, the Jim Crow South or the segregated South. We didn't talk about it that much because it was so painful. You know, there's a real pain, discomfort that can come from keeping these memories alive. But I think that one of the things that, I don't know if surprise is the right word, but I found most noteworthy or interesting is the degree to which Black Charlestonians really worked to keep the unvarnished memory of slavery alive for decade after decade after decade, within their families, within their churches, within segregated schools. You know, this is one of the great ironies of the Jim Crow South, is that segregated schools were a place where Black teachers could teach the truth about slavery, and they did. And so I think that, you know, when we were kind of done, it's a really remarkable story of how much African Americans worked to make sure that people didn't forget. And they worked really, really hard to get these memories pushed into the public sphere, and it took a very, very long time. And you don't really see the fruits of that until after the Civil Rights Movement. But I mean, ultimately, they do succeed.
Yeah.
And you even saw that, just to jump in, and we'll continue on the Citadel side of things. You even see this as the Citadel Citadel student body starts to desegregate in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Some of the earliest classes, some of the earliest groups of Black students there would start to push back against what was at the time often called the Confederate legend, which was really an emphasis on the Confederate history of the Citadel. Of course, countless Citadel cadets fought for the Confederacy, but the long-standing kind of Confederate enthusiasm that you would see among Citadel cadets, waving the Confederate flag at football games. Dixie was I don't know if it was ever really official, but it was unofficial tune for the university at sporting events. And in the late 60s and early 70s, Black students would really push back against this. In fact, I don't know, Blaine, you might remember the story better than I do about the flag and the counter flag.
Yeah. So the battle flag, students would wave the battle flag at football games. This was kind of standard practice, I think, particularly after the football team scored. And Black students complained about this to the administration, and the administration didn't do too much. So I think it was 1971, the Citadel was playing Illinois State, as I recall, and some Black cadets unfurled their own flag. And this flag featured a Black fist kind of gripping or crushing a Confederate flag, which I think is a very powerful image. In fact, I tried really hard to find a record of that image in the course of this research, and but it appears not to be in the archives, so I don't know, we can do a little, oh, okay, I see an expression. I don't know what that means. I tried because I really wanted to put it in the book. It's important to note that there was a lot of backlash against this move. I believe it was the Afro-American Student Society that had done this. And the president of that organization, his dorm room was vandalized, and there was a noose that was hung in his dorm room. So it was a very, I think there was a lot of conflict on campus during that period, because African-American students were essentially calling the Citadel to face the real history of the institution. And there was a lot of reluctance to do that, both among the cadets, but also among the administration. This is kind of what we found in going through the archives.
Yeah.
And one actually useful thing, just to add to that, we found is that there were some white cadets who were supportive of the Black Student Association, some of the other calls that they made for having more Black history courses. There was actually a call for a Black Studies department, I believe, and it's the student newspaper was the Brigadier. Brigadier. The Brigadier, the editor or editors, I can't recall, were pretty. They were pretty out in front in terms of supporting this in a way that might be surprising if you know the broader history of what was going on in other newspapers. This is the time when the Charleston News and Courier was definitely not out in front on this issue. So it's an interesting little slice of Citadel history.
Right. Yeah, and I find that very fascinating as a Citadel alumni.
Sure.
My 4 years here in undergraduate, I never heard the name Denmark Vesey, and I think that shows to a lot of this whitewashing of history of the way that you talk about it in the terms of what we choose to forget, right? And it was only after I graduated that I had learned about Denmark Vesey and who he was and the importance that had at the Citadel and the tension that still resides here, I think, right?
Yeah.
Part of what we do with the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center is that truth part, right? Is putting that words out there and speaking truth to these things that we've placed in the dark. And for me, and to kind of go back a little bit, reading in the parts where you put in about the march at the Citadel Green, and I always think about this like mirroring of the Black regiments that marched to the Citadel Green in the book that you talk about so much, and how when we look at moving to kind of some more modern day examples, if you look back to 2015, after the shooting of Walter Scott and the massacre at Mother Emanuel, the marches happened right on that same pathway, using the Citadel Green as a landmark in where the conversations were having. As we look to modern day, back in May, the Black Lives Matter movement marching down King Street, using the Citadel Green as a landmark again. Again, it's just repetition of this place of the old Citadel being a focal point in these conversations. And so one of my questions is do you see, as the Citadel's origins as a municipal, police, power, do you see any connection to movements, of today, especially around Black Lives Matter and those conversations? And what is the importance that we play in the city, in the dialogue?
Well, I'm going to jump in and try to tackle a little bit of that, and I'll let Blain come up with what else she wants to say. I certainly think that the point you began with, John, and that is one of the things, your own experience as a cadet, not having heard Denmark Vesey's name for 4 years, and certainly a bit of our experience when we were both teaching there in the mid-2000s is that, we were in the history department, so Vesey's name would come up and was known because we're professional historians, but at the same time, it was not a common thing. In fact, I think our last year there, a biographer of Denmark Vesey came to town and gave a talk, a public talk at Citadel. Probably 100, 150 cadets were there, a number of folks who worked at the school. And it was not he had produced his biography of Vesey 6-7 years before that. He wasn't saying anything that wasn't well known in his history circles, but it was kind of mind blowing for a lot of cadets. And also, if I recall correctly, some administrators there who themselves may have been Citadel alum, but people were sort of like thrown, like, really, this is the history of this institution? I thought I understood, and I thought this institution was maybe even more than most universities, was well versed in its own past, right? And somewhat pastward looking in some ways. Yet this portion of it had, if not been whitewashed, although that's probably the appropriate word, had just been cordoned off to the side. And we're just not going to really focus on that, as if the Citadel was born amidst the Civil War 20 years later. So I think the point of your center and the movement about truth is really critical. And I think the Citadel could lead. There's no one who's a cadet like you, people who work there, people who choose to go there, who are responsible for the institution's founding as a part of this system of racial control. but that doesn't mean the institution isn't a part of that, and that truth, sort of thinking about truth and reconciliation commissions, that this underscoring this part of its history is an important step along towards the larger present day reconciliation project and healing project that you've outlined.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we found when we were there, and that probably still exists to a certain degree, is when you point out this history, there's a defensiveness, right? And I think it's important for people to understand that when somebody points out the true history or the real history of the Citadel and of slavery in Charleston, nobody is saying that if you chose to attend the Citadel in the year 2009, that you are a pro-slavery apologist, right? Nobody is saying that. We need to be clear about that. All of us interact with institutions every day that have very complicated and dark histories. We interact with insurance companies and banks, and we read newspapers whose early funding was largely a result of, for example, ads for runaway slaves. Okay, so
That's true, north and south.
Right. So we all interact with institutions that have histories that are complicated. But what we're called to do, I think, is to be honest about those histories so that in the present moment, we can understand and take seriously something like the Black Lives Matter protests. So when you have Black Lives Matter activists standing around the Calhoun Statute and saying, this is a statue, a monument to white supremacy. So we can be prepared to take those arguments seriously and to hear them for what they are. And so I think that is what is at stake in these conversations about acknowledging and confronting the true history of something like the Citadel. Again, the Citadel is not, necessarily the only thing that we need to be talking about here, but something like the Citadel, yeah.
Can I interject one little thing, John Ray?
Yeah.
One of the things you may or may not know is that your former department, the history department, is an active participant in the university's Studying Slavery project. And ironically, the director of that is the child of one of those early Citadel alum, Dr. Felice Ferguson Knight.
Yes.
Yes.
And we have also a lot of work with our archivist, Tessa Updike. And so on our Daniel Library website, they've put a lot of the information on the slave schedules that show that the Citadel, actually owned people. And Dr. Knight is also on the City of Charleston Special Commission on Equity, Inclusion, and Racial Conciliation. So I think it's, like you say, so important to confront the truth. And if we've been part of or central to the problem, we also have license to be part of the solution. And that's really what excites me. John,
and you make a great point about Felice, Dr. Knight, who's, she was a graduate student actually, working with me at Avery when I was there. So she's an old friend. And like you said, her father was one of those early cadets who was dealing with that in I mean, she is in some ways what her father was calling for in 1970 or 71. Right. I mean, it's so that is itself is a testament to what can happen, and that progress is possible on this front. As is, frankly, the fact that the Calhoun Monument no longer stands in Marion Square. I would never have guessed that would have been possible 5 years. Frankly, I wouldn't have guessed that would have been possible 1 year ago.
Yeah.
Right.
So changes can happen, but it starts with truth.
Absolutely. And Blain, I think you hit it right on the head, is that it's not just a Citadel issue, right? This is a large communal issue that we, as folks all across our nation, have to wrestle with, north and south. Just as you said, Ethan, it's an interesting position that we find ourselves in, and something that me and Jay have talked about before is that in some ways we are actually, as the Citadel, are in a position to make those changes happen quickly or quicker because our history is out in front now, right? And that it is out there, and we wear it on our sleeve, and our cadets still wear that same uniform that represents our origins. Whereas other predominantly white institutions or historically white institutions have a similar history, but it continues to be tucked away.
Right.
So, you know, I think that we could sit here and chat with you all day, probably weeks at a time, and probably I would learn more every time. But I want to be respectful of that, and want to just say thank you all, you two, so much for being here with us today and chatting with us. And thank you for the work that you did on just such an amazing book. I mean, seriously, and Jay already said this in her own experience, but this is one of the books that has changed my experience and my understanding of how to operate here in Charleston and to work for equity and inclusion as well, and justice. It's been really influential. So I just want to say thank you all so very much.
Absolutely. And it's just a tour de force of research. You know, as a researcher and a scholar, I'm looking at how much research you all did, and then the ability to craft it into and to organize it so well with so many factual details, so much concrete evidence, and commentary that helps us put things into context. And so one of the reasons that I was so excited to partner with the Cradle Center was as director of our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center, as John alluded to earlier, truth with a capital T.
Right.
Because if we're able to confront the truth in the past, then we're able to confront the truth in the present, and then to, you know, collectively create a truth moving forward. And so one of the things I'm excited about, our Citadel population is going to see a lot of this book. I know John Ray already uses it in his classes, but we're going to have it to be our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council book for the spring and for the university. So I'll be purchasing copies of it for different people with our center budget. And I just can't say how appreciative I am that you all would spend the time with us to talk about this book. And I could just talk, you could teach a whole course just on this book alone. So I'll let John Ray close us out.
Well, yeah, and you know, I would love for you to, Ethan and Blain, to just, you know, where can people find the book, and how can people engage with you, and how can we continue in this conversation with you all as authors of this book?
Well, we always encourage people to try to buy the book from their local independent bookstores. Charleston has several independent bookstores that we love, so we hope that you can.
They all stock it, so please.
They all stock it. And there is a website that facilitates ordering through independent bookstores called Book
Authority.
Book Authority?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you say it again, the title of the website?
Now I got to look it up. I want to make sure we get it right. So
Okay,
Dr.
okay.
Blain, hold on.
Well, he's looking that up because, of course, we know there are other ways to purchase things online, but we do like to support our independent bookstores.
Absolutely.
If anyone is interested, we do also have a website, denmarkveseysgarden.com. And on that website, what you'll find are reviews of the book and things like that, but also a lot of op-eds that we wrote over the years as we were researching, writing this book. One of the things that we wanted to do was to try to reach a broader public audience with our research. And so there is a link there for several dozen probably op-eds. And so some of those can provide some kind of quick reads about some of the things that we found and about our thinking about things like the controversy over Confederate monuments that really kind of started or was given a lot of life in 2015. All right, Ethan, what'd you find?
It is Bookshop, you're right, Bookshop. So search that out, and it will, you can then choose what independent bookstore you want to order it from.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a nice search engine and system that allows you then to funnel your money to independent bookstores, which we need to support. And Jeff Bezos doesn't need any more money. No offense, but yeah, really doesn't.
Right.
But I want to and then echo what Blain said. If people, one of the most rewarding things about writing this book has been unlike, this is the second book for both Blain and me, and we were able, for a variety of reasons, to reach a wider audience with it. And part of that is that we did a lot of op-ed writing and other things, but also because it was written for a broader audience. We had a different sort of press, and it was obviously a little bit topical given the sort of national reckoning that's gone on about slavery and about the Civil War and lost cause. But that's, as a result of that, we hear from more people about what we've written. And as anyone who's a scholar who's written anything knows, you write something and then it goes out, and maybe one of your colleagues talks about it a year later. Sometimes it takes a year and a half to get through to a journal to be published. It's so rewarding to hear and to communicate, whether it's positive, negative, or anywhere in between, to communicate with the public about these sorts of issues. So, I would urge anyone who does read it, all of your students, anyone at the Citadel, I love hearing from people. It's, sometimes I may not get back, or we may not respond to someone immediately. We may so send us an email. That makes it worthwhile. We spend all our time, or a lot of our time, writing these things, researching them, and so that other people engaging them is the whole point. Right? So, so I really would encourage, and don't just do that. Any book you read, write the author. Tell them that. I started doing that, and you'd be amazed. Like, famous people will be like, "Thanks for writing me." So do that. Reach out to them. Let people know what you think. Don't be scared to do that.
Great. Well, thank you all.
Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
We really appreciate it. And for those Citadel folks listening, you can pick up a copy in Daniel Library, and I'm sure we'll have other ways of picking up a copy too. But we look forward to the conversation that it's going to generate on our campus. And again, just thank you all so much for being here, and we really appreciate everything you've done. So thank you all.
Thank you both. This was fun.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.